Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Auto Buyer's Guide podcast where we are all in on extended range, plug-in hybrid, whatever you want to call them, electric pick-em-up trucks because Ram just dropped a whole boatload treasure trove of info on the
A truckload?
2026, a truckload, in the 2026 Ram 1500 Ramcharger, which is quite a name. But
Mhm.
it's going to be on sale this year, most likely by October, is my best guess. So let's roll the intro and then get stuck in.
If you're looking for a new or used car to buy, be a truck or SUV or all-electric ride, we're the guys to help you decide on the Auto Buyer's Guide.
So Travis, let's talk about Ramcharger because this is controversial, I'm sure, in many circles. And I know that there's a lot about it that I disagree with, but I secretly still want one. And I have a feeling you probably
Yeah.
do too.
Conceptually, I am super on board on this particular model in this particular circumstance. I'm hoping the competitor does more of what I'm looking for, but I want to see it. I want to drive it. I want to look at it, and then I will probably be tempted to consider it for myself.
Now let's first talk about the hill that we're dying on, which is PHEV or EREV. So for those that don't
Yes.
know, PHEV is plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. EREV is this, cooked up term that's like extended range electric
Extended
vehicle.
range.
Distinctions with relatively little difference. Think of
Absolutely.
more of a Venn diagram. So every EREV is a plug-in hybrid. Not every plug-in hybrid is an EREV. That's probably the best way to think of this.
Yeah, it's really just like I said, there are so few differences between them. The only way that one could really categorize this is it parallel or serial in operation, and that's one way one could look at it. The other one is what is the larger range? Is it the electric range or is it the gasoline range? But
Mm-hmm.
to all intents and purposes, they are both plug-in hybrid electric vehicles.
Yeah. So the EPA is going to classify this as a plug-in hybrid. It's going to say plug-in hybrid on its window sticker. When we were talking with the Ram people kept calling it a plug-in hybrid system, even though they're calling the truck an extended range EV. They start talking about the plug-in hybrid system. And the only legislative body that has a definition in North America for extended range EV is a very specific category in California dealing with ZEV credits, the zero emissions vehicle credits. This does
Okay.
not qualify for that
Right.
definition. And that is tricky because the only reason that it doesn't qualify is that the gas tank is larger than 7 gallons. If this had a 7-gallon gas tank on it, and it's not a magic number, it has to do with the range, not the actual number of
Yep.
gallons. But if the gasoline range was lower than the electric range, then it would qualify for this expanded credit. And as far as California was concerned, it would get the same number of credits as a full electric vehicle, but you get that free gas engine on the side. But
Right.
because it doesn't do that, and the gas range is quite a bit longer, it doesn't actually qualify for that. So California is going to treat it just like a regular plug-in hybrid. But I posit it doesn't actually matter. What matters more is how the system functions.
Yes, and the biggest thing for me on any of these vehicles and my preference is that it functions mostly like an electric vehicle. So whether that be in its daily driving mode, some of that's going to be just what happens when you push the throttle. The other one's
Mm-hmm.
going to be how often or how big of a percentage of that time does it operate like that. And then the real kicker is when the gas engine turns on to boost the range because obviously we're out of battery or we're out of the battery that's dedicated for that driving mode. When we have the engine kicking on, is it operating like a hybrid or is it operating like an EV? This sounds like it will mostly operate like an EV pretty much across the lineup, but there are some downsides to that.
Yeah, I mean it's technical definitions are tricky here. I mean any extended range EV, even if you add a generator to a Tesla and you just cook that in from the factory,
Hmm.
it's going to be operating as a hybrid in hybrid mode because that's what it is at that point in time.
Right.
It's just sort of a what kind of hybrid is it and how does that feel? Is it going to be more like a serial
Right.
hybrid like a Honda Accord at those lower speeds, or is it going to be more like a parallel hybrid like some of these others that we've seen? And that's where some of the detail gets a little tricky. So let's just dive into the detail that I was able to glean from our press conference with Ram earlier today, and then I'll let you pepper me with questions as we go. So
I have
let
a
me just
few.
dive into this. The heart of this system is a 91.8 kilowatt hour NMC pack. It's not an LFP pack, just in case anybody is interested there. And they're calling it a 400 volt pack, generally speaking, 400 volt pack, although the voltage is
Right.
actually fairly low. It's somewhere around 350, perhaps a little bit under. And that's why the charging speeds are a little bit slow, but we'll get to that in a little bit. The nature of the system is the important thing to understand. So you charge your battery at night and you hop in, it's going to default to its EV mode. The top 3% of the battery is reserved, so you can't ever actually use that. Then
Yep.
we get the
Reasonable number.
usable, right? Then we get the usable portion of the battery, 69.7 kilowatt hours, which does seem strangely small at first glance compared to a lot of plug-in hybrids out there, especially a lot of EVs, because essentially the bottom 17% of the battery is not used. But there's some asterisks here. So
Right.
you roll EV only, 145 miles, you hit 0% state of charge, according to the car, the gasoline engine kicks on. Well, at this point, it actually will still continue using some portion of the battery that is left. So the 69.7 kilowatt hours is simply the EV portion of the battery. Then it will continue using some nebulous amount. They weren't specific, most likely around 10%. So probably another 9 to 10 kilowatt hours of battery pack is used in the EV mode, because in the EV mode, they are wanting to make it drive like an EV. So in many plug-in hybrids, if the battery is exhausted, you have a small portion of battery left to give you maximum performance. And then relatively quickly, you end up with just what the engine can deliver you.
Right.
In this, it's going to be quite different. So in this one, they're saying that it will still give you 4.5 seconds, 0 to 60, 647 horsepower, and be able to pull a 14,000-pound trailer at 0% state of charge indicated. And that's because of that reserve at the bottom end.
So there's, like you said, there's a whole lot going on here, and it is broken up in weird ways. But honestly, I think this is the way that it needs to happen. So first and foremost, your daily commute for the average consumer is going to be covered here by the EV range. So on a regular daily basis, to and from work, you should not be looking at using anything but electricity. So for me, that's a big plus. It is a pretty large battery for a plug-in hybrid. I mean, if you look at other plug-in hybrid options, they are fractions of that in most cases. But in this case, it's a big truck. It's a lot of power. Okay, we just take it as it is. The big thing is that percentage held is so that it can continue to operate with the power output. But that engine is basically the engine is not going to be producing 600 horsepower on its own. It is the standard run-of-the-mill, off-the-shelf V6 that you find in a lot of these other Stellantis products.
Correct. Yeah,
but
it's
when
been
you
tweaked
are
for use here. So they take the V6, they change it a little bit, so the combustion cycle is slightly tweaked. It doesn't have an exhaust gas return system, so no EGR. That's part of why they ended up in the 3.6 liter V6. They answered some questions tangential to this. Instead of the 2-liter turbo that we find in the 4xe products in Jeep's lineup, or some version of the inline 6, they said that in their testing, this engine yielded better power and performance, and more importantly, also better packaging. So a turbo would have involved a turbocharger and an intercooler, extra plumbing, etc. But most of their testing indicated that the 2-liter turbo would require things like EGR, things like that, and possibly premium unleaded. This one's tuned to regular unleaded, but there is a little bit of a catch here. So, and we'll get to this a little bit later as well.
Yep.
The generator and the engine have a matched output, 271 horsepower, 202 kilowatts or so peak. But they won't say how long that peak is good for. They do say it will sustain 130 kilowatts forever until the engine, you run out of gasoline, basically. That's 174 horsepower. So that's a pretty decent difference between those two. It's not going to be a stair-step fashion, most likely. It's going to be, we hit peak here, and if your foot is still in it and it's just roaring, trying to deliver 202 kilowatts, it's going to be some sort of linear scale down to that sustained 130 kilowatts as cooling ramps up and that sort of thing. But it does mean that there is a possibility that at some point you could end up with just a 7,500-pound truck and 174 horsepower on tap, which is why we have that big buffer in the battery. but also why if you engage tow mode, then it's going to turn on the gasoline engine when the battery hits an indicated 35% state of charge
Wow.
plus that hybrid buffer. So it's going to start really, really early.
Right. So the whole thing here on the numbers, and when I said at the beginning, excuse me, conceptually, I'm talking about I really like the way this is laid out because
Mhm.
I don't think we need bigger batteries that aren't going to be used very often. And a truck is a great way to have a lot of batteries that's not often going to be used. And really most of this does seem to be leaning in towards towing, which I think is a great thing to consider
Mhm.
because electric vehicles have a lot of the same benefits as you get with a diesel truck. I mean, it's lots of it's lots of torque. Obviously, it's basically off the line. You can get some regenerative braking, but obviously that depends on how you do your cooling. The big thing here is that most people aren't towing. So that non-tow mode is still going to hold a large percentage so that owners will never have to think too hard about what mode their truck is in. And if you have a truck, you have a trailer, you are putting it in tow haul mode anyway. So now the vehicle is doing just that much more thinking and ensuring, again, that much further ahead that you are not going to run out of power. It does not take in your zero percentage battery. It does not take a lot of power to move that 7,500 pound truck down the road at freeway speeds. You know that 170
Mhm.
horsepower or so is going to be fine. You're not going to have the same passing power. You're not going to have the same oomph if you're trying to race off the line. But I just don't think there are going to be that many scenarios that it
Mhm.
runs into. But I do think Ram here has been really conservative, and I think they're going to have to be because this is trying to get those truck owners who say an electric vehicle won't work for me. They need to make sure that those folks
Mhm.
never run into that my electric truck isn't working for me scenario. And I think they've done just what they need to do to make that happen.
Yeah, this is sort of it's a ballast theory here. So imagine if you had a big water tank and you're filling it with the garden hose, but then you have a fire hose coming out of it. So you're fighting a fire with a fire hose, or you're washing something down with a fire hose. You're not using the fire hose 100% of the time unless you're fighting a fire. That's a bad example. But hey, say you're using your fire hose to wash your truck.
Hmm.
Your dribble of water's coming into the tank. You're using the fire hose now and then, lots of water's coming out. But on the whole, it's difficult to use a sustained output this way, which is somewhat similar to the BMW i3 concept from yesteryear.
Hmm.
Here, of course, the numbers are all bigger. So you could end up using 174 horsepower on a regular basis. If you're in Texas and you're towing a trailer, a big trailer, 75 miles an hour, I wouldn't
Hmm.
tow that quickly myself. But if you were, there's a world where you could be using close to that amount of power.
Yep.
In most other driving situations, you're not. And so the engine's going to be able to keep up. It's going to be able to keep topping the battery off. And then when you need the power, you're going to have 640 available. And then when you dial back on the accelerator pedal, the engine's going to top that battery up and it's going to keep up with this power output demand across a really, really long driving distance. So they're saying, mind you, this is unladen. We'll get
Yes.
145 miles of EV range, 545 miles of gasoline range for 690 miles of bladder busting range in this truck.
And honestly, that number just seems a bit silly to me. I mean, you mentioned that if it wanted to qualify for the California EREV classification, that when you have a 7 gallon gas tank, that one seems
Mhm.
a little bit small to me. But 27 gallons is a full truck fuel tank, and I'm just not sure that's wholly necessary. But that it's neither here nor there. It's not like it's adding a whole lot to the truck.
No,
We're
it's
not worried about
yeah,
adding
small amount of
gasoline
weight,
weight at that point. But
right? And it is
still,
reduced versus the
it's a
regular
huge
truck.
number.
It is reduced versus the regular truck. So the regular Ram 1500 has a 33-gallon gas tank maximum, and you could actually logically get relatively similar total range out of it.
Yeah, yeah. So 600 miles is a lot, but again, this is leaning towards towing. At least in my head, this is
Mhm.
leaning towards towing because hopefully it's not too personal. I'm not going 600 miles without stopping. That's not happening in
Mhm.
any world. I could do half of that, but I'd probably rather break it up in quarters and stretch my legs and move around a little bit.
Yeah.
Really, what it looks at is when you are towing, you are not going to be getting 600 miles. Pick a number
No.
from there. You might be
Yeah.
getting 300 miles. You might get
You
250. And that's why it makes sense to have that. And that's where I think
Mhm.
this vehicle is going to excel. Not that it shouldn't be considered by regular truck owners, but I think this is really gearing towards that almost industrial application. Like we can
Mhm.
get a business owner who does a bunch of towing. You've got the trailer for the lawn care equipment, for your mobile detailing, for whatever else you might have like a
Hmm.
utility trailer for. And then you also use it for your weekend warrior, camping and that sort of thing. That's the key market here, and I hope it does well.
Hmm.
But the numbers are a little bit bigger than I would like, or I think that most
Yeah.
people would need. But
I just
so
I
are
don't
a lot of
see
numbers.
I don't see many people in the actual service industries using this, to be perfectly honest. They
Okay,
will not talk about pricing, but they did say it would start more than the average pickup in North America, which
sure.
median price is 60,000. So we're probably talking about a $70,000 starting point on up to well over $100,000. I just don't imagine that many detailers out there running and buying a Ramcharger for that. The math just won't pencil out on the ROI front.
Well, but
But
you look at a lot of those trucks that are already doing that work, and those are not ROI trucks to begin with either.
yeah, I mean the mobile detailers that we see around here, they are not they're driving beat up old Tundras. I mean like
Sure.
beat up old Tundras or old Chevy Silverados. Nobody's running around in a brand new
No
Ram.
new tungsten Rams.
No one's running around here in a brand new any kind of truck and that kind of thing.
Okay.
Like contractors tend to do this, especially general contractors that own their own businesses in this area. By and large, seem to run around in expensive trucks because it's their sort of all living space, right? They work out of their
Right.
truck, they own the business, so they buy the nice truck. But I just don't see that many people, especially with employees. A lot of mobile detailers around here belong to companies that have multiple employees. I just don't see that many doing that. The mobile detailer that we have used for things, he comes in a minivan. So,
I am
uh,
mostly thinking the
yeah,
business owner and their truck
yeah.
and their
So,
truck that gets used in those ways because it does happen.
yeah.
But yeah, yeah.
I would go. It's probably a very low percentage of the of the intended purchase group here. This seems to be targeted more towards weekend warriors and people that want to tow an outdoor and that sort of thing. And I think it
Mhm,
works better that way with the power offboard capability. You can run your campsite. It'll also support vehicle to load, vehicle to home functionality. We don't
mhm,
have full power output specifications, but it's at least 7 kilowatts because that's what the outlet in the trunk is rated for. I would assume that plugged into your home, it's going to output more, perhaps 9 or 11 kilowatts, something like that. The
mhm,
interesting twist is that Ram is also positioning this not just as the electric thing or the extended range thing, but also as class leading in towing and payload, which does surprise me. So there is
yeah,
no half-ton truck, electric or otherwise, that tows or hauls this much. 2,600 pounds, just over, payload, 14,000 pounds of towing capability, and it is J2807 rated on the towing capability,
okay.
even when the battery is at 0% state of charge. So fully compliant in all those, has a spare tire. This is solidly over every other gasoline truck in terms of the payload and the towing capability because Ford recently killed off the max payload in the F-150.
Mm. I mean, again, this is hitting a segment that, well, it's creating a segment, right? We have
Mhm.
electric trucks from some of the other big three, right? We've got our Ford, we've got our Chevy, GMC, and Hummer, I suppose, all wrapped into one. But this is the first one that can do both. It's not going to be the only one. We've got the Scout on the way, but we have a lot less information about that. And I do
Mhm.
think it's going to be, that's going to be going for a different segment, even though this is considered a 1500. I think this is going to end up being much more of a heavy duty option than we find like something on the Scout truck. I think that's going to act more like a mid-size instead of a full size, even though the numbers, its dimensions might be full size. I feel like it's going to be more like a Rivian in terms of its capabilities, not so much a heavy duty weekend warrior. We can do anything and everything, and I think that's where the Ram Charger will shine here. My question here is about the other applications. So you talked about power offboarding for running your campsite or running the trailer, those sort of things. Was there any conversation about the charge port? Because I'm assuming it's probably going to be a CCS.
It will be a CCS. Stellantis
Okay.
has not said officially, but Stellantis has been very late to the NACS J3400 party. That's not
Mhm.
surprising because pretty much every EV that we're going to be seeing, other than a Hyundai or a Kia or a Lucid, in any time remotely close to now, is going to have a
Yep.
CCS connector on it. That includes GM's new EVs that they're launching, anything that we plan on seeing from Ford or the European car companies. They're all going to be CCS at this point in time. It appears that may be related to certain supplier realities around getting that port on board, but Hyundai, Kia, Lucid, and Rivian were kind of early and aggressive on this. Lucid being the American one that was pretty aggressive on the deployment of this connector. Rivian is going to wait until R1T and R1S get a refresh, it seems like, and we probably will see
Makes
them on
sense.
R2, but the R2 is not this year, so it's that's the timeline.
I'll admit I can understand it, but I'm a little bit disappointed just because if you're bringing a new vehicle to market, it feels like that was an opportunity to start with NACS J3400. Obviously, it's not going to be a downside for a lot of folks for a couple of years. We're not going to see all those CCS ports just snap switching over to NACS, but still, it would be nice if they started that direction and don't have to make a change down the road. I think this is a great option for your vehicle to home because you can have so much more power on board, basically between that battery pack and the gas generator, which you can go fill up, right? If you need to, you can run down to the nearest gas station. Maybe the one down the street isn't working, but you can go quite a ways, fill that back up, and come back and make that happen. Obviously, running the campsite, that's going to be a big plus.
Yeah, it's a very similar proposition to Ford F-150 hybrid with the ability to run a job site or run a home on the battery, power outages, bad weather, etc. This has that same capability without the concern that you have in Lightning or in Silverado, Sierra EVs, etc., of needing to DC fast charge that battery to get back home. So if you were to try and do that in your Lightning or your Silverado, Sierra, etc., there would be a logical end to that, because if you did have an extended power outage, say hurricane or earthquake or whatever, you would then need to go find somewhere to charge to then come back home and continue powering your home. Whereas with this, you could have, gasoline on hand. You could go fill with gas, which is likely going to be easier to do because the gas station can run off a generator, easily power the gas station to then fuel the vehicle and come back home and bring more power. So there is that side benefit there. And like the hybrid F-150, you have that advantage of being able to do this power offboarding with a relatively quiet engine that doesn't have to continuously run. They weren't specific on this, but most likely it's going to function like F-150. So we did an F-150 hybrid test once upon a time where we connected it to our 5 horsepower well pump, and it was totally capable of running the 5 horsepower well pump by power cycling. It spent about a third of the time with the engine off. So it would charge the battery, run the pump off the engine, charge the battery, turn off the engine, run just off the battery, then, repeat and repeat and repeat. This is probably going to do something substantially similar, which means that it's significantly quieter than even one of those Honda inverter generators at a job site. But before we get to the next line item, we should talk about our 5-star reviews.
Yes, we have a couple more. So this is coming through on our Apple Podcasts, I believe. This one titled "A Must Watch for Car Nerds and Car Buyers." So thank you to Squishy Potato 1. This says, "I've been watching Alex on his YouTube channel, Auto Buyer's Guide, for over a decade. Of my hundreds of subscriptions to car-related YouTube channels, they are number one in my book." That is not bad. "Whether you're buying a car or interested in cars in general, Alex and Travis are the duo you need to watch. They are both treasure troves of information, and the podcast is a great extension to the channel. Keep up the great work, guys."
Aww.
Hundreds of subscriptions. That is a lot. So
that is a lot.
Thank you, Squishy Potato.
I don't know about a squishy potato. I think I prefer my potatoes lightly crisped, I think, or fully mashed. Squishy sounds like it's in between.
So, but what is mashed? Is that no longer squishy?
No, it's beyond squishy. That is
the
full
texture
on,
of the mash.
Full on wallpaper paste kind of potato. It needs to be, smooth.
So that was pasty, not squishy.
Pasty, yeah. It's more of a thick liquid. That kind of thing.
We can brainstorm this one off camera
or lightly
later.
Lightly crisped as well.
Our next one comes from Inside Scoop, titled "Great Car Reviews and Car Industry and unfortunately that one got cut off. But it says, what makes this a great car review podcast is Alex and Travis' extensive knowledge, level-headedness, and sincere enthusiasm for vehicles. No hype, no glossing over shortcomings, but also no sarcasm or harshness. They recognize the challenges and trade-offs that manufacturers and consumers face depending on desired driving characteristics, performance, economy, etc. The only complaint is the theme song, embarrassingly cheesy. Get past that, and it's an A-plus car podcast for thinking car people, and I would like it on the record that I had very little, if almost nothing, to do with the selection of said theme song. You should have heard the other contenders. But thank you again, Inside Scoop.
If anybody has any better suggestions on the theme songs, they can always email us at hey@autobuyersguide.com. You can also send feedback on the website. You can call us and leave voice memos. We haven't had voice memos in a while. I'm sad about that. You can email your voice memos to hey@autobuyersguide.com, or you can call us on the old rotary phone at 669-842-1947. Again, that's 669-842-1947. And it is rotary phone compliant, so no touch tones required for leaving that voice memo. This is critical for people like me because I only have one home phone, and it is a rotary phone.
Would you believe I have never used a rotary phone?
I would believe that.
You probably would.
Believe that.
Yep.
I would believe that. And it doesn't have a ringer because I don't want anybody to call home. It's only there.
No.
It's only there should I need to use the 27 volts to spark a fire in a power outage or call 911 because I broke a leg and I'm worried that they may not find me with my cell phone. But other than that,
it's cell service, something bad happened. But
other than that, it has no function. It is entirely decorative, and people just assume that this candlestick rotary phone, they're like, does that work? Does it whatever? And they pick it up and they're like, oh, there's a dial tone. Yeah. So $19 a month for that novelty.
When you pick up a landline and it happens before you dial. I do know that one. Thank goodness.
Hey, dial tones happen at offices too. In this world of return to work, more and more people will be able to associate with the dial tone.
Experience that. Admittedly, my commute down to San Jose would be quite a kicker. So I'm gonna stay working from home if that's okay.
Oh, has Doge not contacted you about that?
So this is my last episode, folks. It's been a pleasure.
No, fortunately, we are not government sponsored. So yes, everybody gets to work remote. Back on actual things, though, I am actually curious as to see whether J3400 will be any sort of impediment to purchasing, because I am going to go out and say no one should ever DC fast charge their Ramcharger because it is going to take so long that you will not want to do it. And I'm actually good if it didn't even have a CCS connector and just was AC charging.
So what were those numbers? What's the level 2? What's the peak DC?
So they would not give us a peak DC. It's 11 kilowatt level 2. So it will take about 8 hours to charge if you're at home. So you could get a complete charge overnight, not a problem at all. Of course, it doesn't really matter because you have the gas tank as well on board. On the DC side, let's just say you're not going to want to do it. 20% to 80%. Bear that in mind. They're not giving us a 10 to 80 like everybody else does. 20 to 80, 45 minutes. 10 to 80 is most likely going to be an hour, and that is the usable portion.
I mean, to my mind, that's just about 90 or so odd miles in about 45 minutes. That's not a great return.
It's not good. 45 minutes in a Leaf would give you more time, more distance, I think. Part of that is because the battery voltage is quite low. So the battery voltage, they're calling it a 400 volt nominal pack. Realistically, it's going to be under 350 most likely. And when it is at a low state of charge, the pack voltage is probably under 300 volts. So it's not going to charge very rapidly. You are going to need a 350 kilowatt station, they are saying, to get the max charge rate out of it, or the peak charge rate, because the voltage is so low. So you're going to need to go high current, low voltage, only going to be available at those liquid cooled CCS stations out there. A complete charge, and we are talking, mind you, about the usable portion of the battery here, not
the roughly 70 kilowatt hours.
So we're not talking about an extraordinarily swift charge here. So a full charge for 145 miles of range is going to take over an hour. You are just not going to want to do it. And I think the defense of this is actually entirely logical. And the engineers were like, it's a plug-in hybrid. If you're on the road, the reason we have this contraption in the first place is because they want a gasoline engine, and so they're going to fill it with gasoline. And you could do that in 5 minutes and get 600 miles of range out of it. So
Yeah.
that's why I'm kind of thinking, then why have this provision for DC fast charging? I guess why not? But it is
Yeah.
going to be real slow. Also, this is going to offend you to your core. If the
Oh
battery
boy.
is cold or if the battery is hot, it's going to start the engine. They would not define cold and hot. But
yeah, that
and I
one does
know
bother me.
and I know you're eye rolling, but this is again another logical thing. So if the battery is cold, if it's negative 20 degrees outside, you're in Denver, you're in Michigan, it's cold
Right.
outside,
Right.
you want actual full performance out of your machine, then it has to start the engine, because you're not going to get that amount of oomph out of a cold battery. And it's not healthy for the battery at higher temperatures to do that either. So if you're in
Right.
Death Valley, car's been heat soaking out there, battery is now 120 degrees, you hop
Yep.
into it, it's not good for the battery to pull all the power out. So it's going to start the engine and pull 200 kilowatts from the engine, so that way it can preserve the lifetime of the battery, because that's a big asset. And this is an interesting twist that I think a lot of people dislike, but this is the engineering rationale behind it. If you have the gasoline engine on board, they use it as a pressure relief valve, for maybe lack of a better corollary
Yeah.
here. In the event of these situations, a regular EV has no alternative but to degrade the battery,
It
right?
just
So
has to endure.
right.
Yeah.
So you have any EV out there that's not going to try and maintain the heat of the battery at an acceptable level, and some will, but they'll run out of battery eventually. So 130 degrees, 120 degrees in Death Valley, black car parked on black asphalt, right?
Yeah.
That's a hot battery after a few days of really searing temperatures. In a regular EV, you have no choice but to start using that battery right away. And maybe you left it 100% full because you needed it the next day, or you thought so, whatever, right?
Mhm.
This is bad for the battery. In this, you have the ability for the car to go, whoopsie, that's not great. Instead of that, let's start the engine, start the air conditioning, cool that battery down, and then in the meantime, pull as much power as possible out of the gasoline engine, whatever I need to out of the battery to still deliver the performance the consumer's asking for.
Yeah.
And then once the battery temperature has normalized, then go to EV mode.
So I'm not entirely opposed to this. But you're right. I don't love it, because why run the engine if you don't have to? But part of my whole stance is about battery health, battery life, battery maintenance, battery resources. And if it is harder on the battery in those situations, then it makes sense to take care of the battery so that we keep that battery living life longer, better, etc. I'm just really curious about what's cold and what's hot, because we're not talking. If we're talking about a standard person's winter cold, and we look at like the average for the United States, and we say, so I'm in the Northwest, and when it gets winter cold, we're usually in the high 30s, low 40s. That's our standard cold. And then it gets really cold, and that'll drop into the 20s, mid 20s, something like that, for a short spell. Okay, if it's in the mid 20s and it kicks the engine on, I'm not going to be upset about that. That makes sense. I get it. But if it's in the low 40s and it goes, oh, engine time, that's where I'm like, well, how much am I really getting out of this? Because when I turn on my car to precondition, I don't want to turn the engine on. I just want to give it time to warm up while I'm on my way out. So that's my only thing. Yeah. Listen, I actually appreciate that they're looking at this. It sounds like long term, and long term is a good thing, especially when you look at resource management. But I just want to make sure we're not being overly protective of it and burning more gas than we have to. So that's where I'll end there.
I mean, here's the deal. I would say, if you're getting any plug-in hybrid, you're going to be burning gas. And if you don't want to burn gas, you shouldn't get any plug-in hybrid, because
correct,
it's still going to have to run the engine on a regular basis to make sure the seals are still good, water isn't in the engine. Any engine that you leave for any length of time, you are going to get bad things happening. You can end up with water in the oil because things have moved around. There's always going to be some moisture in the cylinders, because moisture is created when you burn gasoline, which is why cars steam when they're cold, etc. So there's always going to be moisture around, and that moisture can seep down into the oil. It can
Mhm.
corrode the cylinder linings, etc. You want a nice, healthy coating of oil around the cylinders, etc. at all times. The best way to do that is to run the engine to make sure the gasoline doesn't get stale as well. All those reasons.
Yeah.
Gasoline is going to get burnt. And so if
Yep.
you don't want to do it, you just shouldn't have a gasoline engine on board. I will say that on the regular operation, keeping it plugged in and remote starting your climate control is going to be one way around this. You remote start the
Right.
climate control, it's going to start heating everything up. It's going to, you know, condition the battery to some level, some unknown level, mind you, because details are still sketchy.
Right. Correct.
But it does not appear to have a heat pump. And this is one open question that we've not been able to get an answer on so far. If anybody has info on this, let us know. And this is, again, another one of those engineering decisions. Why have a heat pump? Because you have a gasoline engine on board. We have all these other factors are involved in here. So no heat pump is the critical component of that. It does have an electric air conditioning compressor, of course. Doesn't have to start the gasoline
Right.
engine for that.
Right.
But it appears that heating will most likely be resistance based. And then, of course, later it would then
Engine
start the
supplemented.
engine and just, use the heater core there to start
And
that.
and that's one where with and again, this it's just a me thing. It's not a wholly practical or engineering based thing, but I
Mhm.
know that even with plug-in hybrids that have over a 25-mile EV driving range, I get a little bit annoyed if it has to kick on the engine to warm the vehicle up because we have enough battery on board. It feels like it's playing enough of an EV role to go ahead and have a heat pump to go ahead and
Mhm.
maximize that EV range. Well, that's talking about anything under 50 miles, right? Between that 25 and 50, I'm like, put a heat pump on it or consider it, depending on what market
Mhm.
it's probably going to sell in. And we see a lot of that, or we see more of that happening on something like this with a near 150. That was the original quote, so I'm going to stick to it. 145 is what they're saying now, but around 150 miles of EV driving range, that's a lot of time I don't have to kick on that engine. So I'd rather not. I'd rather it do maintenance cycles and
Mhm.
I'd be fine with that because I understand that. But just to heat the car or the truck in this case, that put a heat pump in it. They're not trying to make this thing cheap, so that feels like a weird place to skimp. I will be excited to test what hot and cold means because if we
Yeah.
get more time with it, that's when we'll be able to put it in a certain scenario and say, all right, let's see what it
Mhm.
wants to do.
Also interesting is the motor arrangement here. So, and they gave us a bit more detail than we had before. Math whizzes, the numbers don't add up. Let me just tell you that right up front. Okay, so 647 horsepower total, 610 pound-feet of torque total.
Mhm.
You don't just add A and B and end up with C, which is the total, because the battery is the limiting factor here. So one motor, the two motors together will equal more than that total is the long and short here. So
Which
335
is
horsepower up front,
yeah, but
332 horsepower in the back. So the rear motor is actually slightly less powerful than the front. Torque is very similar, but the interesting key twist here is that the continuous rating, and I have never seen a manufacturer give us peak and continuous for an EV motor. This is an
mhm.
interesting twist. Maybe it's a world that we need, but at the moment, a lot of people I know fixated on this one in the meeting, and there's just no point of comparison because nobody else has given us this number. The reality is there is a peak and a constant rating on every EV motor out there. We just don't know
Yeah.
what they are. So that said, continuous rating 249 horsepower for the front motor, 200 horsepower for the back motor.
Okay.
Kind of a weird twist. The front motor, this makes one think that maybe the front motor would be the one always being used. And if you're driving down
Mhm.
the highway in steady state travel, that this would become a front wheel drive truck. Not so, because the front motor is the one with the axle disconnect. And
So
interestingly,
that was
that's not actually contained in the motor housing. The axle disconnect is in the wheel hubs.
interesting. That was my first question, right? And seeing that we're looking at different motor output numbers, my first thought is, okay, we have a clear one motor drive. And the question is, which one is which? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about the difference in that design. Obviously, we have a lower output rear motor, and in most cases, the lower output is going to be more efficient, and it makes sense to run that one in your steady state driving because it's more efficient to do so.
Mm-hmm.
But it is unusual because in a lot of cases we see that being the front motor. Actually, especially on a truck, there are a lot of reasons that you would probably want it over the front. One of those maybe being traction. Obviously, if you're driving in snow and you say, "Hey, I need the all-wheel drive," not only is this going to have instantaneous all-wheel drive activation, but you can put it in snow mode and it'll handle things differently. But you have the regenerative capability that's built in there. I was originally thinking when I saw the numbers that this was actually going to be more like what we see on the Jeep Wagoneer S, which is a similar function where the two motor output combined is higher than what we actually get from the battery. But those are symmetrical motor designs, if I recall, and this one is
Yeah,
asymmetrical.
these
So what can
these
you
are
tell us about those different motors?
Yeah, these are it's quirky. So it seems to be mostly packaging related. So
Okay.
the core motor itself is substantially similar, if not identical, front and rear. It's
Mhm.
everything else in the casing that's different. So the reduction gear design is different in the front and in the rear. The rear has an available e-locker, which makes sense because you might want to lock the rear. So you will
Yep.
have that extra capability there. There's no e-locker up front. It does not use the same front motor arrangement. It appears that the full battery RAM Rev will use at some point in time in the future,
Okay.
mainly due to the fact that the engine and generator are located on top of the motor, it appears.
Yeah.
Details are sketchy because they're not being overly specific on what may or may not be shared with the future full electric version, but the power output
Yeah.
levels are ever so slightly different here and there. So I think it has to do with that. If you're in tow mode or haul mode, etc., it's going to leave the front motor connected. It appears the sport modes probably will as well.
Mhm.
So it's not a huge consideration, just more of an intriguing little twist there on some of those details, especially with the
Yeah.
continuous power ratings on these motors. The more interesting thing is again the fact that they're saying that you will be able to do identical Davis Dam performance, which is over 11 miles going up 3,000 feet of elevation in 100-degree weather, whether the battery is charged or not. It will be identical, they're claiming, in performance.
Mhm. And again, that makes sense. That explains why they have blocked off such a percentage
Mm-hmm.
of that battery pack, because obviously that is kind of their standard. And there are not going to be that many more scenarios you run in that are more difficult. Not that there aren't any, but that's going to be a covering a high percentile of the driving situations. I
Mm-hmm.
think one thought I have, if we're adding the e locker to that rear axle, does that not add, or does that not take away any efficiency just in the overall design? Would that still leave that rear motor as the more efficient option if we're cutting down to one?
Now that's a tricky one because they would not say whether the rear motor was the more efficient one or not. We're making an
Okay,
assumption there, which is I
Th-
would say is probably based in reality, but we cannot say for sure.
it's what normally
Um,
happens.
yeah, they have the same reduction gear ratio. It appears that the motor internals are most likely identical, so intrinsically the motors are probably just as efficient as one another.
Okay,
It could be some difference related to packaging in the gear set because the reduction gear design is different. A coaxial design in the front versus a different gear design. I forget exactly what they have in the rear, but it is a different gear design in the rear for the
okay,
reduction gear. So there could be like minor efficiency differences there. What's also
yeah,
interesting is that this uses a unique frame, somewhat logical, like the F-150 Lightning. And the Lightning parallel is, I think, really important here because I
hmm
would be intrigued to see if Ford would cook up or would or could cook up something like this as a next generation Lightning. Because Ford's CEO has been pretty upfront that he believes that big battery vehicles are just not sensible because they're the resources required, the expense, the lowering of
the weight.
efficiency, the weight of them, the reality that
hmm
it charging takes forever, et cetera. All of this he believes is an intrinsic problem in big battery truck EVs, and I think he's
hmm
definitely correct there, at least for now. So he does not seem to be interested in doing what GM was doing with the huge battery EVs. So I'm
Yep.
interested to see if he does something like this because the core design of the vehicle is kind of lightning like. The frame is 8 inches wider than a normal Ram 1500, and the frame is
Okay.
totally unique front to rear, absolutely different. Nothing is shared frame wise because it
With
has to be able
the
to
Ram
support
truck, but
with
yeah.
the regular Ram 1500 because it has to be able to support the differing mounting points for the motors front and rear. It has a four corner independent suspension, not a solid
hmm
axle in the back like most trucks, but that is very much like the F-150 Lightning. So
Right.
very similar in that respect there. The front half of the frame area between the axles is battery. The back
Mhm.
half is gas tank and some emissions systems like the evap canister, things like that's located back there.
Mhm.
So that's how things are packaged in the body here. The interesting thing is that this is going to have an adaptive air suspension system. So I'm curious to see how this rides. The benefit of the four corner independent plus the adaptive air suspension is really intriguing.
Mm.
Lightning is, I think, the best riding regular truck in this segment.
Mhm.
It has a really great ride, and the rear does not get upset over broken pavement. Ram is very close with their air suspension, but you can still get a little bit of wobble in the back because of that solid axle. This is going to have the air suspension in addition to the independent suspension. And they're saying the highest rated axle in this segment, which is how they're getting that 2,600 pounds of payload, 100
Mhm.
pounds more than a Cybertruck, even though this has a spare tire and significantly more range, which is kind of quirky and interesting. And of course, it's bigger inside than a Cybertruck as well.
Well, and one thing that it's going to have over the GM options is obviously the overall range, which we understand is split between gas and electric, leaning
Mm-hmm.
heavily gasoline. But they're not it's not carrying around all the weight, which is obviously going to help its overall payload because it's a lighter
Mm-hmm.
vehicle by 1,000, 1,500 pounds,
Yep.
just kind of from the word go. So that's certainly going to help. And while those have an air suspension, let me tell you, you feel like you are driving that weight around. So if you shed 1,500 pounds off of that, that's going to feel like a race car at that point,
Yeah. This
comparatively.
is
So
roughly
it should be pretty comfortable.
Yeah, it's roughly 1,000 pounds lighter than Silverado or Sierra, about 1,500 pounds lighter than Hummer truck, because Hummer truck's got the wide body arrangement and extra protection.
Hmm.
So it's a pretty substantial difference. It's about 600 pounds ish heavier than a Lightning, so definitely on the heavy side there, but not
Yeah,
far off of something like a Rivian. The Rivian is really quite heavy, so is a Cybertruck.
yeah,
Cybertruck is
dense.
obviously on the light side actually for some of
Yep,
these electric trucks, but there are considerations there with Cybertruck. I mean, it gets to that lighter curb weight by having a substantially smaller battery than the GM trucks,
right.
by not having a spare tire, by being hideous looking. I mean, that probably doesn't make it any lighter, but you know what I mean. Um,
Yeah,
so interesting twist there. And the full size spare is also an interesting twist because
yeah.
that's something that we don't see in any of the other trucks except for Lightning. You get a temporary spare tire available in the Rivian R1T.
Mhm.
Cybertruck can have a spare, but it has to sit in the bed and takes up bed
Yeah,
space. Ditto
yeah.
for the GM trucks by and large. The Hummer, you can get spares, but they occupy the bed space, etc. So, interesting twist. Although, one asterisk there on the GM side, you could put a temporary spare tire in their front trunk and have similar space to this because this does not obviously have a front trunk. That's where the engine lives.
Which I think is fine. I do have two questions. One is a quick one. I think one is something that we can dive a little further into. The first is, was there any conversation about this being able to handle a fifth wheel?
Yes, actually, that was a big question. That was one of my questions because, fun fact, my dad really wants one of these. Interestingly,
Hmm. Okay.
I'm casually curious. I'm
Mhm.
Ramcharger curious. My dad
Ramcharger,
is
yes.
my dad already identifies as a Ramcharger owner, I think.
Mhm.
Um, and they would not say. Here's the official answer. They said
Oh,
there will be no gooseneck or fifth wheel from the factory. No factory provision.
okay.
Their thought process was they said, well, we see a customer interested in that being interested in a 3/4 ton truck.
Dude,
It's like,
yeah.
okay, but your half-ton truck does 3/4 ton things. It does 1 ton thing, 1 1/4 ton things. 2,600
Uh-huh.
pounds of payload is literally
Uh-huh.
more than a 1 ton
14,000
truck
pound
used to
trailer.
be, right?
Yeah.
With a
Yeah, yeah.
14,000 pound trailer. Fun fact, you cannot conventionally tow more than 10,000 pounds in many states in the US already without a commercial or non-commercial license,
Right.
non-commercial class C
Yeah,
license.
yeah.
So with your regular license in California, for instance, 10,000 pounds is it conventionally. You
Right.
can bump up more with fifth wheel though. So that's one reason to get an aftermarket hitch. And they would not say what their their position was on aftermarkets. They said, well, the aftermarkets will do what the aftermarkets do. I'm going to
So
go ahead and assume that there will be, because the payload's high and the
yeah,
towing limits are high, so it's a
right.
natural fit.
So so that one's a little bit annoying because again, I
Mhm.
look at this as its greatest strength comparative to the other trucks on the market, the EV trucks, which this is
Mhm.
mostly going to act as, is its ability to tow. So it would seem only reasonable that in all of the marketing promo, stuff, that it's towing a fifth wheel because it says, "Hey,
Mhm.
we can tow a bumper pole, we can do the fifth wheel, we can haul whatever your barrels of whatever. You can put a slide-in camper in it. This is the truck that can do everything a truck can, and it's the
Yeah.
first." Right?
No
I'm saying
comment
that's the
on slide-in
opportunity,
campers either, mind you. Like,
and that's yeah,
some
yeah,
car companies will say, I believe it's Ford. Ford does not say, or actually specifically says, no slide-in campers technically in Lightning, as I recall. They would
right.
not
And
say there
I'm looking
either.
at that going, this
We'll
is the
see.
opportunity for Ram to
Yeah.
go. This is the ultimate truck,
But,
uh,
I agree
but
too. Like, I will
apparently not.
2 points of clarification for anybody out there that's listening, just before we get the flood of emails complaining about towing limits in California. There are
Mhm,
actually a decent number of states, about half of Americans live in a state with actually relatively restrictive towing laws, where in some states it's cut and dry. There are weight limits around fifth wheel and conventional towing.
mhm,
And then there are states like Texas where you have to go by a gross combined weight rating. And then there is commercial use between states. So if you're a general contractor and you're towing using your general contractor truck with your license number on the side, and you're towing from California to somewhere else, then you got to worry about DOT rules. But at any rate, GCWR stuff, you end up in a relatively similar range. So you really can't tow 20,000 pounds without a CDL essentially anywhere in the US, whether that's a commercial or a non-commercial CDL. Just
right.
those are the way the rules work. But on the other side, it is intriguing. Like Lightning, you'll be able to put any of those bed accessories, like your sliding camper that you like, in here because the bed's the same.
Yeah, and that's great because you'll have a lot of current Ram owners that want to carry things over, or the new RAM owners who don't want to have to wait for the one off from one company doing the one thing they're looking for. Probably already exists. They can order it and go ahead and throw it in. And in the
Hmm.
world of trucks, where you have usually a specific purpose or a wide range of things, you go, hey, here's what my truck needs. It's nice to have those things because, like I said, sliding campers are a thing that aren't really out there. Rivian is the adventure truck, and I know of one company right now that makes a specific kind of pop up tent slide in thing for the Rivian, and that's one of one
Hmm.
because it's got unique bed dimensions. So
Yep.
having those things built in line is definitely a plus. So Alex, my last question here is about its overall efficiency, and then it plays into twofold, right? Because we have two fuel types: we have gasoline and we have electric,
Hmm.
and then we have a number of vehicles on the market right now that we can compare this to, and it compares honestly, to my mind, surprisingly well in the at least in the electric range, because we have other examples that are going to be beating it, and that's something like the Rivian, which to me is the more
Hmm.
sporty of the options. Obviously, it's shaped to be an electric truck, and it's not trying to emulate a currently existing F-150 or a current Ram. But then you look at something that is purpose built, something on the far end, like you get the Silverados and the GMC Sierras. We'll leave the Hummers out for a moment, and even those are going to be coming in less efficient than this one. A lot of that's going to be down to how heavy they are.
Yeah.
But this does pretty well at about 2.1 miles a kilowatt hour, right?
Yeah, that's the general, efficiency profile according to the EPA estimates. I should be specific on that one if I accidentally
Sure.
said this earlier. Not EPA rated yet. These are EPA expectations.
Yeah.
Lots of disclaimer there. So 2.1 miles per kilowatt hour ish, which puts it below Lightning, below Rivian in the EPA efficiency cycle for the battery types that we're
Mhm.
talking about here. Also below Cybertruck, if I am recalling Cybertruck's numbers correctly. A
Yes.
little bit better than Silverado and Sierra, but that's not too surprising given the curb weights involved. So the Rivian, it's not too far off this in curb weight. It's a little bit lighter. The F-150 Lightning is a reasonable amount lighter, but of course it's an aluminum body, and this is a
Mhm.
steel body largely. There's some aluminum bits on it, but it's largely a steel-bodied truck
Yeah.
with of course the battery underneath. And that would be big battery Lightning curb weight to
Right. Right.
Ramcharger here.
Closest comparison. And yeah.
1,000 pounds lighter than the GM Silverado, etc., Sierra lineup there, because those are steel unibody trucks with huge batteries. The battery's more than double the size of the battery that we find in here.
Yep.
So I think the efficiency rating is pretty respectable around there, bearing in mind that highway efficiency is going to be a lot lower. So that combined rating is skewed towards city driving and low speeds.
For sure. And then when it switches over to gasoline, this is where we've talked about it, and we agree to disagree in which way we'd like to see things happen. But it comes down to it is not running the most efficient version of a hybrid system, but still coming out to about 20 miles per gallon is pretty good. I mean, I basically went and looked at what are other trucks getting in the 4-wheel drive, because obviously that's going to lower your fuel economy a little bit. But everything else is going to be within a few miles per gallon, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but obviously we're talking about percentages as well. 20 miles per gallon is not a huge number. So, a 2 mile per gallon increase is a notable increase, but it doesn't feel like it's as far off as I thought it might be.
It's about where I thought it would be.
Okay.
Bearing in mind that an F-150 hybrid is going to be at least 15% more efficient. And that efficiency difference is going to likely grow on the highway. So I would expect F-150 hybrid to be at least 20% or more efficient on the highway, likely even more efficient than that when you're towing versus this system. Towing is going to be a unique circumstance with the efficiency numbers, and it will remain to be seen exactly how this all lines up. But in those use cases, serial hybrids tend to really have efficiency struggles. And that's where I am surprised that they didn't have a parallel hybrid mode to try and improve steady state highway performance, because they could very easily have done that without disrupting the EV performance. It could have been done in a way where the motor would just clutch in or clutch out, and you still have the electric motor there, lots of torque, big battery, big buffer, etc. So you could still have had 600 horsepower, but have had a drive mode where maybe they just jammed the Pacifica's hybrid system under there so that we could connect to the front wheels and and drive that along only in parallel hybrid mode. In case people are wondering, the core reason that serial hybrids are not as efficient is because there's simply a lot of power conversion going on here. We have a gasoline engine spinning a generator. There is loss involved in the generation of electricity. Then you have to convert the electricity from one voltage to another, because it's not like you're just feeding that power directly into the motor.
Right.
Generally speaking, the way that these vehicles do this is that they rectify the power, because you're generating AC power, you rectify it, you create DC power, you shuttle it off to the DC bus. So voltage is roughly similar to what the batteries will accept. So you just jam it on the DC bus. Batteries may charge, maybe they're discharging, whatever. That gets then taken up by the inverter module on the motor units, front and rear, converted back to AC power to power the motors. We do not know all of the efficiency numbers, but we do know, for instance, that Ram has, again, this spec sheet is weird because Stellantis occasionally does unusual things with their spec sheets, giving more info than other car companies. For instance, we know that the generator is 95.9% efficient. So if you give it 100 horsepower, you end up with 95.9 horsepower out of the back end. Or more correctly, for electrical power here, you feed it 100 kilowatts, you get 95.9 kilowatts out the back end. The tricky part with this is a lot of people think that automatic transmissions are stuck in the 1970s as far as efficiency. And modern automatic transmissions will have power transmission efficiencies in lockup that are easily the equal of that 95 to 98% efficiency. And this is just one component of the efficiency here. We don't know what the efficiency of the inversion circuits are, the motors themselves on board. We don't know the charge cycle round trip efficiency on the lithium-ion battery pack. It's going to be in the high 90s. All these are in the high 90s, but they're compounding lose. You lose 5% here, you
those
lose 5%
percentages
there.
add up.
Right, it all adds up, and that's why parallel hybrids tend to be more efficient, all things being equal as much as possible, which is also why pretty much every nominally serial hybrid out there has a parallel hybrid mode, whether it's the Outlander or the Accord, etc. Most of them have a parallel mode just because of this, to try and improve efficiency.
But what I will say is that that's compared those numbers, right? When I said within a few miles per gallon of other trucks in the segment, those are the full size 1500 4-wheel drive, basically your standard engine layouts.
Mm-hmm.
What I would counter with is looking at something like the RHO, which is
Mm-hmm.
going to be the sport truck Ram, and that one EPA combined is about 15 miles per gallon. And obviously, this is tons of power. It is not meant to be the same machine. It's not getting the same kind of off road tires or suspension travel or that sort of thing. But if you're looking for a high performance truck in Ram, you're looking at the RHO. But now you're also looking at a Ramcharger
Yep.
with a lot more power and actually a lot more efficiency.
Yeah, that's actually not a bad way to look at it. I would posit, because in a world where we had a street sport truck RHO, mind you,
Hmm.
which we do not live in, it would
Right.
probably be getting 18 miles per gallon. It would be substantially similar to the other twin turbo Rams, because the RHO's efficiency issues are aerodynamics, wide body, etc., and
Hmm.
tires. So wide body plus tires whacks 4 to 5 miles per gallon off of those efficiency numbers. It would be you'd be getting very similar numbers to the regular 500 something horsepower tune of the inline six there, which is actually pretty close to this. Mind
Hmm.
you, this is going to be quicker 0 to 60 and have more towing and more payload, though. So you get this bump in capability without losing too much efficiency. The
Yep.
downside would be if you actually cared about efficiency and cost efficiency both, F-150 hybrid is going to be significantly more efficient and significantly more cost effective.
But is it
And
as sexy,
it
right? I
is
mean,
not
it
as
doesn't have the big number,
arguably just about as capable, of course, as well, because even though it
Mhm.
doesn't have the regular dedicated vehicle to home function, you can plug your home in the twist lock out back and run
Right.
7,000 watts of something off of your F-150 hybrid. The interesting twist here, I think, for me would be how many people are really going to be cross shopping these other options. I would assume F-150 hybrid might be a decent cross shop for those that are being very rational. For people that
Yes,
are
yes, yes,
simply
yes.
worried about cost of operations, the diesel Silverado and Sierra are fantastic.
Yep.
I mean, those get truly exceptional fuel economy.
And that was when I looked at, so
Yeah.
22 city, 25 highway rated.
Yeah. Of course,
Yep.
diesel's more expensive, and diesel has about somewhere around 20% more energy in it than
Right.
gasoline. I'm sure people will comment on the exact amount of energy difference. The diesel cycle is also a tiny bit more, generally speaking, efficient. So all of that compounds and helps. But
Yep.
yeah, it's an interesting proposition in this segment for sure, and one where I have to go back to our previous comments and questions about this. I am surprised that there is no factory fifth wheel or gooseneck provision, because that really would be a truly unique addition to this. And
That's what I'm saying.
I want to know who out there is working on such a thing. We
Hmm.
again do not know exactly how it would bolt on, but since there is a frame, it is a body on frame
Hmm.
truck still, there is a place to put it. And that's not something that we see possible in a Silverado or Sierra, which do not have a frame. They're unibody trucks. So I would not be putting a fifth wheel or gooseneck on those.
Hmm.
But this has a frame. So you can cut holes in the bed, bolt it right to the frame. I don't see a problem with that. That's one of the
Yeah.
advantages of this, really, is that capability, in addition to that, the accessory installation ability, whether you want to do that slide-in camper that you were thinking of, or you want to put a transfer tank in the back because you need to get diesel for your whatever,
Hmm.
or you just want to have, I don't know, 1,000 miles, 1,500 miles of driving range with a transfer tank in the
Yep.
back for gasoline. All that
Yep.
will fit on. Really, the only things that won't bolt on would be anything that bolts to the frame. So if you're thinking rock
Right.
rails, things like that, and they're frame mounted, that wouldn't work. But accessory side steps that bolt to the body, that should work, because I believe the body bolt patterns are identical
Yeah, I
except for
know. Yeah.
where they match to the frame.
Yeah, so I think those are kind of one off. I don't imagine there are going to be a ton of folks who are in a real big hurry to take this like rock crawling, but I do kind of look at this as as a somewhat competitor, something like a power wagon. Don't crucify me for it. It's not a one to one,
Mhm.
but if you're saying, hey, I want an off-road adventure vehicle, this could be a very, very cool off-road adventure vehicle, assuming that you're not trying to do something too intense. If you want to do overlanding, not rock crawling, this is going to be a great
Mm-hmm.
option because you have tons of power on board. You can run everything if you want to. You basically run everything through the truck instead of having to have separate power systems built in to whatever else it is you're operating. But Alex, it comes down to my last question here, and it's my last thought, and it is about the upcoming competitor, which is the Scout truck,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
Terra, I
Mm-hmm.
believe. There's the Traveler and the Terra. So I think the Scout Terra with its range extender, what's going to be the big differences between that application, which we still don't have a lot of numbers about, so this is
Yeah.
some guessing and speculating, but what's going to be the biggest difference between the Ramcharger and the Scout? Because I was with you. I thought that Ford would be the
Mm-hmm.
first one to have this layout in production. They are not. We have not heard anything
Mm-hmm.
substantial on it. So it's going to be Scout or Ramcharger here. And what's going to be the big differences?
Yeah, things are a little uncertain at the moment. Mind you, Scout is quite a ways off. So we have
Yes.
we have very early prototype bodies and interiors, very little drivetrain detail on the Scout side. Scout is trying to be more of a full-size truck. Dimensionally, it is certainly more full-size than some of the other options that we have seen. Definitely more full-size cab than either Cybertruck or Rivian. So it's a solid competitor, I would say. We don't know all the details on its range extender. The general
Mhm.
thought has been it's most likely going to be a Volkswagen 2-liter engine. Probably a 2-liter turbo has been the thought.
Mhm.
So if you're anti-turbo, that may be one thing to think of. 4-cylinder engines generally are going to be a little bit less polished, a little less smooth than a naturally aspirated V6 like this. The Pentastar actually is pretty smooth. If you're driving around in a Pacifica plug-in hybrid, for instance, the engine's actually nicely isolated. This is a body-on-frame vehicle, so it's going to be more isolation than you would even find in a Pacifica. The exact details of how the body and the frame on the Scout interact with one another, we do not know yet. If it is like the Rivian, where the Rivian is a body-on-frame vehicle, but the two are actually glued to one another and bolted together with some bolts, then you probably will get more harshness in the cabin. That's just a wild random guess there. I think a lot of the rest of the difference is simply going to come down to is it regular truck or is it startup EV something? And Scout's
Mhm.
probably going to be a mixture of worlds because they're fully owned by Volkswagen. Who knows where the lawsuits will go? But at the moment, it's going to be sold direct, and dealers
Mhm.
really want to change that because they're suing the socks off of Volkswagen North America on this front. I'm suspecting that there will probably be some sort of meet in the middle compromise. I'm guessing. Who knows who will win the lawsuits, mind you, but
Sure.
that's a second question. Um, the Ram is probably going to feel more like a regular Ram. Obviously, it looks like a Ram. It's the steering rack is the same as a regular Ram, etc. All of that's the same. The biggest difference is just going to be the suspension in the rear, the fully independent
Mhm.
suspension in the back. The Ram appears to be much more focused on towing and hauling, whereas the Scout seems to be more focused on outdooring and being sort of a
Yeah.
slightly bigger gasoline electric Rivian, if you will.
It's
Longer
got a
term
very
support.
solid lifestyle vibe,
Yeah.
for sure. And so I don't expect it to have the same. I don't expect to have the same payload numbers or the same
Mm-mm.
towing numbers. I think the early indication is that the overall range is going to be a lot less than 600 miles, and that's even split between the battery and the
Mm-hmm.
gasoline range extender, which I expect we'll see less horsepower. We'll see a smaller battery, or we'll see a bigger battery but a smaller engine and a smaller gas tank. That
Yeah.
that sort of combination. But it also has things like a solid rear axle, which are obviously not going to be lending itself towards efficiency nor comfort. So I think I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking at that more of a lifestyle, uh, well,
Mm-hmm.
lifestyle, but also more capable in niche scenarios. So in my head, it's more of the light duty version of this technology
Yeah.
application, and this RAM is going to be more the heavy duty application of this layout.
Yeah, some of it also is going to depend on what you expect out of your electronics. Do you want regular truck experience, which is what you're going to find in the Ram? Do you want the stupid
Hmm.
passenger screen, which I find absolutely useless, but you're going to be required to buy in the top end trims?
Hmm.
Or do you want the techie thing that's kind of Rivian like as far as the infotainment systems and software goes? My concern on the Scout, honestly, I think would be longer term support and parts availability.
Mm.
What's Volkswagen going to do long term with Scout? Volkswagen, is a major car company that got deep pockets, so parts availability should be fine as long as Scout
Yeah.
continues around as a thing. But Volkswagen's parts have generally been more expensive in the US. So if they do use a Volkswagen engine, which is the widely assumed thing, I can't imagine they're going to go and buy a GM engine or something like that, right?
Right. Or build
Then
their own.
then parts are going to be more expensive. If you take a look
Yeah.
at a 2-liter 4-cylinder from General Motors or Ford or the Stellantis group of companies that was designed and made for the US versus a Volkswagen 2-liter 4-cylinder, just general maintenance parts are more expensive for the Volkswagen because they're using different suppliers from Europe largely and just lower volume, et cetera. So the Pentastar V6 has been one of the highest volume V6 engines in the US. They jam that thing in everything. And
I mean,
largely this is the same engine.
the truest version of off the shelf that you could possibly
Right.
manage.
So oil filters, replacement parts. I mean, if you need a new, if later it needs to be rebuilt and you're worried about rings, valve seats, everything like that, it's going to be a lot more common. And
Mhm.
if RAM can build enough of these, then generally the other components might also be relatively common. On the electronics front and how reliable is this going to be long term, that's anybody's guess. Motors generally are pretty reliable. They can
Mhm.
have issues. Just ask any early EV adopter. There can be issues. The battery, that's hard to blame on Stellantis because they're not making the battery. They're just buying the battery, like every other
Right.
company out there practically. The body, the glass, all those components, those are going to be easy to find as well. Crashes, if you get into an accident, replacing things are going to be cheaper on this logically than a lot of other vehicles because there are a lot of Ram trucks out there, hundreds of thousands of this same
Right.
bed design are sold every year. So if you back into something, the bed's the same, no problem. The
Mhm.
quarter panel, that's going to be different because of the charge door, but it's a steel panel, so it's not going to
Ooh,
be
charge location is where?
front quarter panel, right in
Front
front of the driver,
driver or passenger?
front fender, driver.
Okay.
So right there on the driver's side, front wheel adjacent. I don't see any logical concerns around that sort of thing. All the glass is the same. So if your windshield breaks, it's the same. Not the same thing in Silverado Sierra, for instance, though. Those are more
Right.
expensive than regular Silverado and Sierra windows because it's not the same glass.
Mhm.
We don't know what insurance costs will be like. Expect it to be higher than a regular Ram, but
Yep.
perhaps less than a TRX or something.
When do we get to drive the dang thing?
We don't know for sure, but it's probably going to be somewhere around October, is my guess. Because all they would say is second half of this year, which means they did
Uh-huh.
not want to say fourth quarter because that sounds too late. And
Got
they
it.
didn't want to say third quarter because that sounds too early. So this logically, reading the tea leaves for what car companies always seem to do, the games they play in describing things, that means it's probably
Yeah.
going to be right on that dividing line. Early fourth quarter is my guess. So they're going to squeak it in right there around October. That's what I'm
See, our
assuming.
viewers and listeners know that we've talked about this in depth, but it's because we're very excited. It's because it's the first application, again, of this technology in this segment. We're very excited to see it. I want to drive the darn thing already. I'm
Yeah,
sick
I
of
am.
waiting. I want to drive it. I want to tell you what it's like, and I can't because I haven't driven it.
Its turning radius is still large, over 40 something feet, and it's big. So I don't rationally believe that it could ever replace what I tow with, but I am casually curious. And
You might give it a go.
and undoubtedly, I do love the concept. I am all on board with this range and even the efficiency numbers because, generally speaking, I would be electric only. And when I do tow things, I tend to tow quite far distances. The closest service center for some of our heavy equipment is over 200 miles away each direction. So I would need that 400 miles of range to drop things off and then go and pick them back up again. And this would be perfect because at that, I don't care about the efficiency so much if I'm not doing that, except maybe a few times a year.
Right.
And kids would fit in the back. Child seats rear facing
Yes,
in a half-ton truck,
if
absolutely no
if
problem.
that cab is regular Ram size, you're gonna have plenty of room.
Big back seat, no problem.
Yeah.
But the price tag, that's I'm guessing that's going to be a problem.
Like the rest of the truck, not small.
Yeah, and I would also have to regrade the private road that we live on and convince a neighbor to cut down a few trees and make the turn bigger,
Mhm.
so I could
Mhm.
actually get around it with this
It's a big
behemoth.
commitment.
That's probably not going to happen either. Anyway,
Yeah, that's all right.
everybody leave your 5-star reviews, hit that subscribe button. If you haven't found us on the YouTubes, then find us on the YouTubes, because you can see our smiling faces and you can help us
Mhm.
get to the appropriate number of watch hours so we can actually monetize it. That would be lovely.
Ooh.
And
And
if you
if we get enough folks, somebody noticed last time that my cat made his appearance. He has taken himself
Yeah.
from the throne and is demanding attention. If we get enough folks, he might make an appearance.
he might even get on camera. Hey, and my
Mhm.
cat could get on camera. They could talk to one
Oh
another.
my goodness.
Yeah.
What isn't that what we tune in for?
Yes, that's the safest interaction with cats, because they can't claw each other. So yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. See all of you later.
Adios.